Okay, thank you. Thanks very much. I'll just try and share my screen. It's always interesting. Screen. Okay, so hopefully you can see something that looks like a slide.
Yes.
Okay, let's start. Sometimes this jumps around a bit, so forgive me if that happens. Yes, so thank you for the introduction. Today I'll be talking about the international community and the G word, the genocide word. As well as being an academic, I'm also a professional French-English translator. So I'm also very interested in how translation and interpreting have impacted on the way the genocide is spoken about in different contexts. But today I'll be focusing on the core term genocide, and more specifically, I'll be examining the very complex issues relating to its use, or indeed its non-use, by the United Nations and by the US government in relation to genocide in Rwanda in 1994. There's also very much to be said about French use of the term genocide in relation to Rwanda, but that would give us far too much content for today. And I actually published an article about that a few years ago, so I would invite you to look me up and look up that article, which is called A Genocide of Little Importance, to quote François Mitterrand, if you are interested. So a little bit of context, you may not, I think I'm the only paper in this conference on Rwanda, so you may not be very familiar about it. So very briefly, a bit of background context. The genocide was carried out by Hutu extremists targeting the Tutsi ethnic group from the 6th of April to the 4th of July 1994, and a very conservative estimate is over 800,000 people were killed. There was, however, killings, discriminations, dehumanization, as we had a paper last night about dehumanization, propaganda targeting the Tutsi in Rwanda since the establishment of the Republic of Rwanda under a Hutu government in the early 60s. And to complicate matters, there was a civil war between the exiled Tutsi, the ones that had left Rwanda in the 60s and settled in Uganda. So there was a civil war between them and the incumbent Hutu in Rwanda between October 1990 and 18th of July 1994. So this also complicates the matter. What killings can you attribute to civil war? What killings can you attribute to genocide? And that's also complicated the way of looking at what we call genocide. So two linguistic terms that will underpin my analysis today are denotation, that's the literal dictionary definition of a word, and connotation, so that's the secondary associations evoked by a word, so the overtones, the implications, and very often connotations are emotional responses. So you often hear people saying that a word has a positive connotation or a negative connotation. It was the belief in the importance of having appropriate and adequate terminology in place that led to the creation of the neologism genocide by Raphael Lemkin in 1943. His interest in international criminal law, as we know, was motivated by his belief that the impunity enjoyed by those who were responsible for planning such crimes, as attested by the example of the Armenian Genocide, was a core problem that should be resolved. So Lemkin was inspired by his early training as a linguist as well as a lawyer, and he believed a possible solution lay in the creation of a precise term that would enable legislation to be formulated to ensure appropriate sentencing. Following the end of World War II, Lemkin lobbied for the use of the term genocide at the Nuremberg Tribunal. The term was included in some of the indictments, but it didn't appear in the judgments. However, in the wake of the Nuremberg trials, it was deemed necessary to have the appropriate laws in place to prosecute genocide in peacetime or aggressions targeting the target group. And so this resolve culminated in the term genocide being formally adopted in the United Nations Convention on the Prevention and Prosecution of Genocide of 1948. So something I'd like to highlight here is that the creation of the term by Lemkin and its definition within the framework of the Genocide Convention are indicative of the pursuit of a very precise denotation for the purpose of arriving at a definition that would exclude or at least minimize ambiguity. Moving on to Rwanda, the question of whether the term genocide could apply to what was happening in Rwanda was already raised twice by United Nations investigators in reports lodged in 1993, so 1 year before the genocide, regarding various attacks and massacres carried out throughout the country and that predominantly targeted Tutsi. So the March report, the original report was in French, and that's my translation of a very small part of the French version. The document was not translated in full into English, but a summary was given. So what I think is interesting here, so I've highlighted in red the bits that I think are really important, that are worth looking at. In both the March report and in the August report, there is the clear statement that people have been killed. There are many people, many Tutsis have been killed for the reason that they were Tutsi. There's absolutely no doubt about that. So you've got the language, the testimonies prove. And in the August report, you have the statement that the violence indicates very clearly that the victims have been targeted. In both of these reports, whether or not this can be called a genocide, the language there starts to get a lot more abstract, a lot more we're not sure. So the question remains in the March report as to whether the designation of the ethnic group Tutsi as a target for the destruction stems from a veritable intention in the sense of the convention to destroy this group or part of it as such. The English summary, strangely enough, is a lot more firm by saying the Commission finds itself obliged to conclude that there have been acts of genocide as contemplated by international law. So just keep that phrase in mind, acts of genocide, because we'll see it again. The August report, they again clearly say Tutsis have been killed, but their conclusion is Article 2, paragraphs A and B might therefore be considered to apply to these cases. And so there seems to me to be quite a degree of abstraction there. It's not coming out saying very clearly without ambiguity that genocide has occurred. But don't forget, this is before what we officially know as the genocide. So moving on to Rwanda 1994, we'll start by looking at how this G word was handled by the UN and the US, and then we will look at why, or some suggestion to why. So the shooting down of the Rwandan President Habyarimana's plane on the 6th of April 1994 sparked a strong escalation in the attacks targeting the Tutsi, and it marked the beginning of what we now call the genocide. However, at the time, the question of whether this concerted aggression should be formally recognised as genocide was a highly contentious question. And so to the extent it became known as the G word, a euphemistic allusion that encapsulates the highly problematic nature of its application. Within the UN, care was taken to describe the events in Rwanda using a far more nebulous range of terms, so chaos and indiscriminate violence. Among those members of the UN who opposed this conscious blurring of the facts was the New Zealand ambassador Colin Keating, who was then president of the Security Council. On the 29th of April, he sought to issue a presidential statement acknowledging the events in Rwanda as a genocide. But this initiative provoked heated debate and was vigorously rejected, with the call to categorically prohibit such incendiary language outside the chambers. While essentially seeking to achieve the same goal of circumvention, a different approach was adopted by the US administration under President Clinton. In complying with the directive to avoid the term genocide, several government officials used the tactic of deflecting the focus of the discussion to a question of semantics. So on the 28th of April 1994, for example, State Department spokesperson Christine Shelley stated in response to a reporter's question, well, as I think you know, the use of the term genocide has a very precise legal meaning. Before we begin to use the term, we have to know as much as possible about the facts of the situation. The same script was clearly being followed by Madeleine Albright, as illustrated by the following exchange from a press conference on the 4th of May. 1994. So the reporter says, well, given that so many people say that there is a genocide underway, why wouldn't this convention be? Well, and Albright says, I think, as you know, this becomes a legal definitional thing. Unfortunately, in terms of as horrendous as all these things are, there becomes a definitional question. This same lack of clarity continued to permeate the rhetoric of the US government spokespersons in their statements in the subsequent weeks. The most well-known example occurred during another press briefing by Christine Shelley on the 10th of June 1994. And this exchange has been frequently cited because of its awkward linguistic gymnastics. You may be familiar, you may have seen this somewhere. So Shelley starts off by saying, we have every reason to believe that acts of genocide have occurred in Rwanda. That phrase that we saw before. And the reporter asked this brilliant question, how many acts of genocide does it take to make genocide? Well, that's just not a question I'm in a position to answer. Well, is it true that you have specific guidance not to use the word genocide in isolation, but always to preface it with these words, acts of? Well, I have guidance, which I try to use as best I can. There are formulations that we're using that we're trying to be consistent in our use of. I don't have an absolute categorical prescription against something, but I have the definitions. I have phraseology which has been carefully examined and arrived at as best we can to apply to exactly the situation and the actions which have taken place. So we will leave her there. The US discourse shows an overriding concern for what should be left unsaid at all costs, rather than what should be clearly articulated. The persistence in seeking to reframe the debate as an abstract matter of definition points to the crucial distinction that I identified at the beginning of the paper between denotation and connotation. In fact, the linguistic smokescreen created by the US sought to focus attention on a very cloudy vision of the denotational value of the term genocide. I would argue that in fact, both the UN and the US, their positions were strongly impacted by the connotations that were, rightly or wrongly, deemed to be embedded in the term genocide. So what were those connotations? Firstly, the idea that using the term genocide creates a legal imperative to intervene. It was believed that in the light of the UN Convention, officially acknowledging the events in Rwanda as a genocide would necessarily carry that legal imperative that somebody must intervene, the UN and or the US. However, as Gregory Stanton, among others, has elucidated, the belief that a response was mandatory is in fact an erroneous reading of the wording of the convention. It only specifies in Article 8 that any contracting party may call upon the competent organs of the United Nations to take action. So it's not must, but may. And I think it's very ironic for all the fuss about the importance of the legal definitional meaning of the term, the UN and the US apparently failed to undertake a careful, close reading of the convention to elucidate its actual stated meaning. The second connotation is that using the term genocide creates a moral imperative to intervene because of the mantra of never again. The UN Convention, interestingly, places the notion of prevention in the sentence, in the title, before the notion of punishment in its wording. And therefore, the phrase never again became commonly associated in references to the convention. Prevention was a key issue. But as we have seen, and I'm using a slide that I think Carola used last night in passing, It's one of my favorite slides that I like using with my students. So it's a very graphic illustration that this moral imperative was perhaps more of an ideal than something that was ultimately binding. I mean, how many times can we say never again? And the third and last connotation is the association of the term genocide with the Holocaust. So Romeo Dallaire, the head of the United Nations peacekeeping force in Rwanda at the time of the genocide, made the comment in an interview 10 years later, for Westerners, the term genocide refers to the Holocaust. The idea of a new genocide was inconceivable. So why was it inconceivable? Well, firstly, because something that we discussed in the panel last night, briefly, the uniqueness of the Holocaust. If you talk about genocide, the Holocaust is in a category of its own. And for Westerners, genocide meant Holocaust. But also because the Holocaust was really the point of reference. In Rwanda, the machete was portrayed as the weapon of choice, although that was also a gross simplification. But if you take that on face value, it's impossible to conceive as genocide as being possible, being achievable with a simple handheld weapon, an agricultural tool, compared with the tools for mass killing that were seen in the Holocaust. So ultimately, these three connotations can be seen as extremely flawed, especially with the benefit of hindsight from 2020. But at the time, they were powerful motivators of inaction on the part of the UN and the US. So returning now to questions relating to denotation, I would like to raise a final important point, the importance of precise terminology. Key elements in the UN Convention definition are, as I've highlighted here in red, the intent to destroy, and also the notion of the target group, the national, ethnical, racial, or religious group. From its earliest usage in relation to the events in Rwanda in 1993 and in 1994, we see strong evidence of a semantic shift where genocide is interpreted often as synonymous with the killing of large numbers of people. In other words, the term genocide loses its denotational force as signifying the crime of crimes, the original idea for the term, and comes to mean something like mass murder, where the number of deaths is a crucial factor rather than the intent to destroy. Similarly, the importance of the target group is frequently lost in the terminology used to evoke genocide. And in this regard, there's the example of the term Rwandan genocide. If you say the Rwandan genocide of 1994, non-specialists may indeed be left wondering who is the victim and who is the perpetrator in that story. It's not clear. We don't talk about the European Holocaust or the German Holocaust. We talk about the Jewish Holocaust if we're going to be specific. In terms of UN discourse, another couple of examples, the UN wording in this regard was actually initially very precise. When the UN finally recognized genocide in a report issued on the 28th of June 1994, about 1 week before the genocide ended, it was specifically stated that the term genocide should only be used to designate the victims from the Tutsi ethnic group, the target group, whereas the deaths of Hutus are characterized as assassinations. However, as evidence of a shift, the UN's current online outreach program on the genocide notes that in 1993, extremists were planning a campaign to exterminate Tutsis and moderate Hutus. So this phrase of the genocide in Rwanda against Tutsis and moderate Hutus has become quite common in the public sphere. And I would say this erroneous representation of the extremists' actual agenda of destruction that was solely focused on the Tutsi can be seen as a significant distortion of the core denotational meaning of the term genocide. So why is it important to use precise and appropriate terminology? It is important on many levels, notably for justice, to ensure adequate sentencing of perpetrators, and to bring also a sense of closure to survivors from the target victim group. It's important for peace building and reconciliation in the post-genocide community. And it's also important if we're thinking about the legacy of the genocide, or the legacy of the tribunals, or the history of the genocide for future generations within the post-genocide community, and also for the international community. So after this very whirlwind presentation, in trying to be very brief, I'm sure you'll have many questions, but I have a final question for you that I'd like you to think about. We can perhaps discuss when we get to the questions. And it's a question that I often think about, and it came back into my mind last night when I was listening to the presentations that we had in last night's panel. So it's actually, I've put question or questions because it's actually the same question, but I've put it in two different ways. So, will the moral best practice to prevent genocide that is enshrined in the UN Genocide Convention inevitably always be relegated to a distant secondary position behind the prevailing geopolitical agendas of those countries who may be in a position to intervene? Or in other words, Lemkin's goal of punishment through the use of this specific term genocide has been achieved, as we've seen with the ICTR and the ICTY. But is prevention ultimately an unrealistic expectation that stretches the implications of naming genocide too far? So that's my presentation. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much again for a very informative talk. I especially love qualification you give